Gale is routinely ranked the most popular origin story to play, and I think there's several reasons for this. But I also think the reasons are not as straightforward as people like his goatee and his earrings, so it requires some exploration. For now, be forewarned that this video will contain story spoilers. If you've taken the time to talk to Gale at length, then you'll know that a big part of his questline and story revolves around Mystra and Netheril, and specifically, a man named Karsus. To give you a brief reminder, Karsus was the only wizard in the history of the realms to attain godhood by means of a spell. Notice, I did not say to attain godhood, period, as Azuth, the god of wizards and Mystra's most trusted servant, was once a mortal mage. Rather, Karsus was the only wizard in the history of the realms to attain godhood by means of casting a single spell he developed, for however briefly, and brief it was, not but a few seconds, but a god he did become. This spell, called Karsus' Avatar, is also the only 12th level spell to ever exist or to be cast by a mortal mage. But did you ever wonder how this was possible, and how Karsus even managed to achieve this? Furthermore, what is precisely the nature of Gale's relationship to Karsus? He certainly talks a bit about it, referring to Karsus' act as it has come to be called, namely Karsus' folly, even going so far as referring to his own attempts jokingly as Gale's folly. But to understand this, we need to understand why Gale finds Karsus and Netheril so intriguing, and most importantly, why Gale, Karsus, and Netheril are also uniquely human in the context of the Forgotten Realms, and indeed broader fantasy tradition, because I believe the appeal of Gale lies in the nature of humanity itself, and how it's portrayed in Dungeons & Dragons. To understand the nature of Netheril, you must first understand that it represented a wholly different Faerun from the one Tav or Gale inhabit today. 5,000 years ago, Netheril was little more than half a dozen or so fishing villages. Eventually, the humans of this age began to trade with the elves, a race that at the time was far more advanced than the humans in virtually every respect. And one of the most important things that the elves traded was the practice of magic itself, and some elves would generously tutor humans that showed arcane promise and displayed the patience necessary to master the art. Within 2 or 3 generations, magic had become essential to the once isolated and simple communities. And then something happened that would forevermore change the course not just of Netheril's history, but all of history in Faerun. This was the discovery of the Nether Scrolls. The Nether Scrolls were 2 sets of 50 scrolls describing virtually the totality of all arcane theory ever devised, and had been penned by the creator races in the days of Thunder, well over 30,000 years ago, and thus even at the time of Netheril were beyond ancient. With this discovery and the intense study of the scrolls, Netheril's wizards, called arcanists at the time, were able to rapidly progress and outstrip the rudimentary magic that the elves had taught them, far exceeding even practiced elven magic users. This worried the elves, as they foresaw the short-sightedness of the humans making leaps and strides with little wisdom to hold them in check, and their relations worsened in time. Having grown independent of the lessons and constraints the elves had tried to teach them, the Netherese began to exploit magic in earnest, achieving things that modern-day wizards could only dream of, such as their famed floating cities, removing and carving out entire mountains, and the destruction of whole armies with the flick of a wrist and a few spells. You see, one thing you must understand about Netheril is that magic itself worked differently back then, and in the simplest of terms, it was more powerful as well as more flexible, and even bakers and street sweepers had access to basic magic, the equivalent of cantrips, called cantros. There were also fewer rules when concerning magic. For example, the Netherese could often cast their magic without the need for somatic components. Furthermore, arcanists had no need to memorize spells, as must do their modern counterparts. They could simply reach into the weave, the source of all magic, and pluck out the mystical energies they sought. They still needed to record their spells they knew within their spellbooks to review from time to time, but were not required to spend hours studying spells, and this set of circumstances gradually changed the psychology of Netheril's wizards over the millennia. Now this is important to understand because it provides the backdrop to the story of Netheril's fall, and in particular, Karsus' ascension and destruction, and ultimately will help to understand Gale's story better than we otherwise could. Now here, what is of greatest interest to us, as pertains to Netheril, is primarily Karsus, likely the most powerful wizard who ever lived. The era into which Karsus was born was posthumously, and appropriately, referred to as the Shadowed Age of Netheril, and it began with the birth of Karsus, exactly 357 years before its fall. All powerful arcanists of the time used magic to extend their lifespans well beyond human limits, and Karsus was no exception. Karsus began casting his first magical cantros at the tender age of 2, a remarkable feat, even by Netherese standards, as if by instinct. A few years later, he seemed to learn spells almost as if they were part of him, and he was so precocious and talented that the local clergy of Mistral took an immediate interest in him and began to train him, as well as rather unsuccessfully attempt to indoctrinate him into church dogma, most of which fell on deaf ears. In fact, Karsus quickly came to the conclusion that the pantheon of gods was rather unworthy of faith and worship in his eyes, a view that certainly shaped his own disastrous decision later on, and one that was frankly shared by many Netherese arcanists. These were go-getters and doers, and none to be fettered by the petty gods, having surpassed virtually all other magic users of their time, and of course far surpassing their former mentors, the elves. The Netherese believed themselves in many ways to be one step away from godhood, and their unbridled use of magic and total irreverence towards the gods reflected this. Religion and faith were matters for the unwashed masses, or so they thought, and many Netherese arcanists held the view that the gods were at best useful for political reasons, and at worst utterly useless. And Karsus, at the astonishing age of only 22, became the youngest arch-wizard to ever grace Netheril. To do this, he literally carved an enclave out of a mountain and erected a city upon it, claiming it as his own. Whilst all this was happening, Netheril had been facing an ongoing threat from without. For the longest time, the Netherese had been making wanton use of magic, heedless of the consequences, and indifferent to the negative outcomes it had produced. And one of these outcomes was the destruction of huge swaths of stable magical areas underground, where a sinister and alien race called the Faerun lived. Faerun are monstrous aberrations, highly gifted in the arcane arts, and they require a stable magical environment to live in, which was being destroyed by Netheril's reckless use of magic. In retaliation, the Faerun developed their own spells that drained the life from Netherese lands, and above all, from their floating cities. This led to the departure of many Netherese archwizards, and the destruction of many enclaves, which in turn led to much political chaos at this time. Netheril appeared to be coming apart at the seams, and Karsus felt it was his sole responsibility to stitch the once proud nation back together, and now the threads come together. You will recall that Karsus had little reverence for the gods. Well, for an untold number of years, Karsus had secretly been laboring away on a spell of such magnitude that it would dwarf any other spell mortals had ever developed or cast, and he deemed this the appropriate moment in history to finally cast it, and show the world, and the gods, just what he was capable of. This spell, again called Karsus' Avatar, would forever change not just Netheril, but the very workings of magic itself in the Forgotten Realms. The spell allowed the wizard who cast it to temporarily steal the power of a god, through a combination of ambition, pride, and legitimate concern for the fate of Netheril. Karsus cast the spell, temporarily stealing the power of the then goddess of magic Mistral. And as Gale himself explains, Mistral was integral and essential to maintain the weave, and in some interpretations is the weave. Thus, had Karsus stolen the power from another deity, say Shar or Selûne, although destructive and dangerous, it is unlikely that it would have been as catastrophic as what ensued after he cast a spell upon Mystra. More so with humans than any other race, knowledge has always exceeded wisdom, and Karsus, perhaps more than any other human in history, embodied this principle. To go into some detail, this was the only 12th level spell ever created, a testament to Karsus' arcane prowess. It was designed to temporarily steal the powers of a deity, and when he cast it he chose Mistral, the goddess of magic, in the process forever changing the way magic functions. Mistral's position required that one of the aspects of her psyche constantly rework the weave of magic, something she could no longer do, and in the face of both Netheril and the Faerun's constant abuse of magic, the weave crumbled. Only by sacrificing herself could Mistral save the weave, and a few moments later, she was reincarnated as the more rules-governed and orderly Mystra, the polar opposite of the chaotic and laissez-faire Mistral. But it was too late. Most of Netheril's floating cities had been destroyed, and immediately, Mystra enacted new and strict rules concerning magic. Wizards would have to sleep and memorize spells they learned, and there would never again be any spells cast higher than 10th level. Many have wondered if the spell that Karsus had devised had been written down and preserved, and it had, but Mystra sent the spell, Karsus' avatar, to the end of time itself, ensuring no mortal would ever again gain access to it. This, of course, is somewhat of a contradiction to what we discover in BG3, but that is the previous historical position on it. As for Karsus himself, it is said that before he died, his bloated and petrified body fell from the sky, his stony eyes filled with the rapidly fading divine power he stole, but he was still able to catch a final glimpse of the fate of Netheril, as its majestic cities plummeted to earth, killing all who dwelt there. The last emotion he is said to have felt was heartbreak. Too little, too late. He realized his greed for the power of the gods themselves cost him his home, family, friends, people, and most importantly, his entire civilization. It is for this reason that his failure is called Karsus' folly, and the elves call him the child who would be a god. Now, humans have always occupied a special place in fantasy settings, beginning with J.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, where the race of men are referred to as the second born, as they were born millennia after the elves. They bear the gift of men, sometimes also referred to as the gift of Ilúvatar, the supreme creator. And this term is both ironic and sincere, since it refers to men's mortality, as they uniquely, in contrast to elves, can escape the confines of the world and leave it behind for something greater. Now, that is not the vision of humans one encounters in Dungeons and Dragons, and specifically the Forgotten Realms, but it certainly has taken inspiration from it. Humans are quick to learn, quick to achieve, but also quick to stumble, and sadly, also to die. It's often said their industry and ambition is the result of a desire to make the most of their short lives, and in many ways they do so, as the current era in which Baldur's Gate 3 takes place is considered the era of the human, where all the formerly great kingdoms and empires of other races, be they elves or dwarves, or the still far more ancient creator races, have ceased to be relevant. And it was this haste to achieve that allowed the Netherese to achieve the soaring heights of magical power they did. But it was also this haste, almost entirely bound by lack of foresight, that led them, and most egregiously among them, Karsus, to fail in the most spectacular way possible. In this sense, humans are both the most remarkable and flawed race in the Forgotten Realms, and it's from this perspective that we can truly appreciate Gale. Gale has basically 3 arcs or endings that he can pursue. They all represent something different from the human perspective, and Larian allows us to explore all of them, and they all touch upon something different that satisfies us in different ways. He can, unlike Karsus, become a true god, and that is in some sense satisfying, as one interpretation, indeed a view offered by Gale himself, is that the gods are selfish and uncaring, and that he had been used by Mystra because she fears usurpation of her dominion over magic. So in her mind, or at least in the interpretation of her thinking by Gale, let this mortal pawn blow himself up and kill 2 birds with 1 stone, both the Illithid threat and the Nether stones, as Mystra would brook no mortal or god who wielded magic detached from the weave. Gale becomes the god of ambition and makes an enemy of Mystra, and that can certainly be fun. But is that truly the most satisfying ending? Well, that depends. It's certainly not the typical happily ever after ending. For example, if Gale becomes a god, why can we not level the same claims and accusations at him for not caring about mortals? Most gods, not wholly evil, claim to care about their worshippers, and in some sense they do, as faith and worship are the fount of divine power that gods require in order to persist in their divinity. But at the time, Gale the god has become very much something he despises, and his portfolio of ambition is largely born of resentment and bitterness. And so it begs the question, how different will Gale the god be from the rest of the gods in the Pantheon? Likely very little, as the Pantheon has a number of ascended mortals, and virtually all of them, surprise, surprise, behave like gods, as I am sure Gale will as well. Thus becoming a god, whilst an absolutely amazing RPG ending to have on offer, does little to resolve Gale's internal conflict. If anything, it amplifies it. Of course, Mystra herself is not without her share of guilt, and the gods are all too willing to justify their mistakes and flaws as if by divine right, but either way, Gale is not emotionally or internally better off for having become a god. And although he can take his potential lover and deify them, that simply seems tacked on more than anything else. Still, it's a good thing that this pathway of ambition can be fully explored and realized, and culminates in what can only be called the greatest of ambitions. Alternatively, Gale can return the crown to Mystra, for which she shows gratitude, and depending on the choices, whether Gale has become an illithid or not, can save his soul, and take him with her to Elysium. And this act of humility can also lead him down the path of a humble yet seemingly contented life as a professor of magic, and if you've romanced him, you can marry him as well. This is, one could argue, the prototypical good ending, as he redeems himself in the eyes of his goddess and earns a new life, so to speak, allowing him to live out his days in a better place than he had before. Whether befriended or romanced, the main character's interactions with him have given him a sense of humanity he lacked, since Mistra's purported love for Gale was predicated solely on his prodigious magical talent, as she likely cared not a whit for his personhood. This story arc is satisfying because if you befriended Gale and accept him despite the danger he poses, over time he will come to realize that you value him for his more personal qualities that have little to do with his magic, and there is a degree of relatability here, more so than with the other arcs. Many humans in the real world may excel at something and pursue that thing relentlessly to the detriment of all else, which in turn leads to other humans honoring only the object of pursuit and the talent associated with it rather than the entirety of the person holistically. This is perhaps the most relatable story arc for Gale from the player's perspective. However, my personal favorite ending, and I think in many ways the most impactful one, is the ending where Gale sacrifices himself for the greater good. I don't say this because I dislike Gale, quite the opposite. Rather, it represents the best of humanity. If Karsus represented the best of ambition, coupled by lack of wisdom, then Gale's sacrifice represents the best of both kindness and wisdom, realizing the necessity of responsibility he has to the world, and more importantly, to the friends he's made. It's certainly a lot simpler than the other arcs, but I think there's a beauty to the simplicity and nobility of his sacrifice, lacking in the others, that exemplifies some of the best behavior humans have on offer, and this is why I personally think it's the best. Now, what do all of these story arcs have in common? They explore facets of experience in the context of D&D fantasy that are prototypically human. Elves and dwarves, for example, tend to be much more generalizable and tend to conform far more to certain patterns than do humans. And I believe the appeal of Gale's story, and the fact that he is by far the most popular origin story character, is a reflection of that. Every other character has, in some sense, a much more straightforward path, but not Gale. Gale simply has the right mix of the tragic, triumphant, the arrogant, the noble, and the humble that other characters lack, all of whom tend to be more straightforward both in their presentation and in the execution of their story, which isn't a bad thing, but it is different, which in my estimation makes Gale more compelling than any other origin character, of course, reflected in his popularity as the #1 origin character to play. Finally, the conjunction of Netheril and Gale as converging upon each other was one of the best things done in terms of the overall story of BG3. They complement each other in a way you cannot find among the other origin characters, who are, frankly speaking, a bit more one-dimensional and less nuanced. And ultimately, it serves as a wonderful example of the Dungeons & Dragons human archetype who stumbles and fumbles, but also gets back up and triumphs, walking the edge of ambiguity, all the while remaining satisfying in different ways in every iteration of his story, which likely explains why Gale is the most beloved origin character. Thank you everyone for tuning in, and if you like my content, you can leave a like, comment, share, and subscribe, as it really helps out the channel. Be much appreciated, and I will check you out next time. Take care.